Thanks very much, Brenton, and thanks to all of you for coming here this evening to engage in this conversation with me. It's a pleasure being here in Upper Arlington in Ohio. As you all know, they've got bright lights in my eyes, so I can't tell how many of you are old, but I think you all know that in the 20th century we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools because civil rights lawyers, litigators, figured that if judges couldn't figure out anything else, they might be able to understand an argument that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated and inferior law school. And then that precedent was used to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And then, as you all know, we went on in 1954 in the Brown versus Board of Education decision to end legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And then the Brown decision gave stimulus, impetus, inspiration to an activist movement of civil rights activists, people who engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. People lost their lives. That movement, that civil rights movement, persuaded eventually much of the country, maybe not everybody, as we're seeing today, but much of the country, that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful not just to African Americans, but to whites as well, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. By the end of the 1960s, we'd abolished segregation in everything from lunch counters to buses to interstate transportation and public accommodations, employment, swimming pools and water fountains. And then at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement came to an end. It went home, folded up its tent, left untouched the biggest segregation of all, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. You live in one of them. I've lived in many of them. Every community I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. How could it be? We came pretty much as a nation to understand that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-concept as a democratic society. How could it be we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Partly, I suppose, it's because it's harder to undo residential segregation than any of the other forms of segregation that we address. We prohibit segregation on buses, and the next day anybody can sit anywhere there's an empty seat on a bus. But if we prohibit segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what all of us have done, and I mean all of us, myself included, you, Democrats, Republicans, Northerners, Southerners, Easterners, Westerners, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, what we've all done is developed a rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for failing to do what we really should know we should do, and that is eliminate segregation in neighborhoods. And the excuse we give ourselves, the rationalization we give ourselves is something like this. We tell ourselves that, oh, segregation of buses or lunch counters or interstate transportation or swimming pools, that was all done by government, by ordinance, by local policy, by federal statute sometimes. If it was done by government, it was a violation of the Constitution. If the federal government was violating civil rights by creating segregation, it violated the Fifth Amendment, and if there's a Fifth Amendment violation, we have an obligation as American citizens to do something about it. If state and local governments were doing something to violate civil rights, to segregate, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and we have an obligation as American citizens to do something about it. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that was something entirely different. That wasn't done by government, not by law, by regulation, by public policy. It just sort of happened. It's accidental. It's natural. We have residential segregation maybe because of private bigotry, private homeowners landlords wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it's because actors in the private economy, businesses, but not government, discriminated in how they carried out their roles. Real estate agencies, banks, insurance companies. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because people like to live with each other of the same race. You know, we feel more comfortable that way. And so we are attracted to neighborhoods where people of the same skin color as we live. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just an economic result. African Americans, on average, have lower incomes than whites. Not all, but on average they do. And so many of them can't afford to move to middle-class white neighborhoods. All of these bigoted but individual, personal, private sector, economic decisions and actions is what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves it happened by accident. It can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. It's too bad. I think most of us think residential segregation is too bad, even though we live quite comfortably in segregated communities. But we don't feel an obligation to do anything about it. We live in an apartheid society, which we all accept as part of the natural environment. Well, I spent most of my career, at least in the last half of the 20th century, writing about education policy, not about housing. I knew nothing about housing policy. I was for a while the education columnist at the New York Times. I was writing education policy work. And during the 1990s and early 2000s, I spent a lot of time denouncing, attacking, criticizing the dominant educational theory in this country. And the dominant educational theory in this country at that time, 20, 30 years ago, was that we had a serious problem of an achievement gap between black and white children. Black children, on average, have lower achievement than white children. And we told ourselves, and again, across the political spectrum, we told ourselves that the reason we have this achievement gap is because teachers have low expectations of black children. The teachers just don't try very hard to get black children to learn. And only if we could force the teachers to work harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought it was a ludicrous theory, but it was widely shared. In 2001, we passed a law, which you may recall, called the No Child Left Behind Act. It was bipartisan. It was promoted by President George W. Bush. In the Senate, it was sponsored by the most liberal Democratic Senator, Ted Kennedy. In the House, by the most liberal Congressman, George Miller. The No Child Left Behind law required that children be tested every year in math and reading, and it predicted that if we held teachers and schools accountable for their test scores, the achievement gap would disappear in just a few years. As I say, it was a ludicrous, absurd theory. And I tried to explain in the writing I was doing why it was so ludicrous. And I remember one column I wrote, I won't go into too much detail on this, because that's not what I'm here to talk about tonight, but one column I wrote about asthma. As you may know, African American children in urban neighborhoods in this country have asthma, typically at 4 times the rate of middle-class children living in suburbs. 4 times the rate. They have asthma at such a high rate relative to middle-class children because African American children are more likely to be living in urban neighborhoods that are polluted, diesel trucks running through them, vermin in the environment, deteriorated buildings not well maintained, lots of dust. And I tried to explain in this column that if a child has asthma, not every child, but if a child has asthma, that child might be up at night, wheezing, come to school the next day sleepless, drowsy, hard to learn, or harder to learn than if the child had come to school well rested. And I tried to explain if you have 2 groups of children who are identical, 2 identical groups, you don't have to be a statistician to understand this, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, 2 identical groups of children except one group had a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group was going to have lower average achievement simply from being drowsier. Not every child, but on average there would be a drowsier group. And I said that no matter how high teacher expectations were, no matter how much you tested a child, you can't wake a child up with higher expectations. And I went through example after example of this. Asthma, lead poisoning, homelessness, economic insecurity. You can do the same kind of syllogism with every one of these two groups of children, identical in every respect, except one group has this socioeconomic disadvantage. And it's going to result in lower achievement. If you add them all up, you pretty much explain the achievement gap that no amount of testing and higher expectations is going to solve. And so this is the kind of thing I was writing about, and then gradually I realized, I'm a slow learner, but as you can see, I've had lots of time to learn. I gradually realized this one thing: if a child comes to school with one of these social and economic disadvantages, what happens when you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity or stress from environmental circumstances? How is a school like that ever, no matter how many laws we pass, ever going to have the same achievement as a school where children come to school healthy, well-rested, well-nourished, in economically secure homes? Of course, it's absurd to expect that result, but that's what we were requiring by law. So this is what I was thinking about in 2007 when I read a Supreme Court decision that was evaluating a program of two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of those school districts had a very, very token desegregation plan, because when we concentrate children in schools with these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools, in fact, are more segregated today in this country than they ever have been for the last 50 years. And they're more segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So the districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington were trying to address this problem. They had a very token desegregation plan. They gave parents in the district a choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to further exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who was going to minimize segregation. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school and you had one place left in that school, both a black and a white child applied for that last remaining place, the black child would be given some preference. It's a trivial plan. I mean, how often do you have one place left in the school and two children apply for it of opposite race? It never, almost never happens, but the Supreme Court examined this program, denounced it, said it was unconstitutional, said the school districts had no right to do such a thing because it said, it's true, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the controlling opinion. He said that, yes, they're segregated. And they're segregated, he said, because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought this was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That's actually why the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated. And then he went on to say that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto. That's the term he used, a term we all use. And he went through all of the reasons I just described. Bigoted landowners or real estate agents not willing to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Actions in the private economy, banks, real estate agents. Self-choice, wanting to live with others of the same race. Economic differences. He said all of these things is what's caused de facto segregation. And he said if government didn't do it, government is prohibited from undoing it. Only if it's not a civil rights violation if government didn't do it, and only if it was a civil rights violation would government be permitted to address it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something that happened in one of these school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, some years before. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in a suburb of Louisville called Shively. It was an all-white suburb. He had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville, renting an apartment. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife, a child, a good job, wanted to move to the suburbs, but no one would sell him a home there. And so the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second home in his suburb and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white neighbors surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home, and the police made no effort to stop this. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having started a riot by selling a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the courts, the jails are being used to enforce apartheid in the community of Louisville. And I looked into it further, and I discovered, and I'm not exaggerating here, there were thousands of cases here in Ohio, in New York, New Jersey, California, Illinois, Pennsylvania, thousands of cases of police-protected mob violence that served to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of them, where the police was abetting, sometimes even leading this violence, was a civil rights violation, a violation of the Constitution. And none of us have ever taken up a responsibility to remedy it, as we're required to do as American citizens. And then I looked into it further, and I found out it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that had created and maintained racial boundaries in this country, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies that were racially explicit, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites couldn't live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country, this one as well as all others. I don't have time to go into many of them I've described in the book, but I'll just focus this evening on two policies of the federal government that were very powerful in creating segregation. One I'll begin with is public housing. Now, I have to say at the beginning, and I'm sure most of you, as I did before I began this research and learning about this field, most of you think that you know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men perhaps who don't have jobs in the formal economy, a lot of police activity, deteriorated buildings. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country during the New Deal, in the Roosevelt administration, during the Depression. Poor people weren't allowed in public housing. It wasn't for poor people, it was for working families who had jobs, who could afford to pay rent, who could afford to rent apartments, but for whom no apartments were available because there was so little construction activity going on during the Depression. Public housing wasn't subsidized, it was collecting rent from the middle-class, working-class families who were in it. The first New Deal agency that built the first civilian public housing in this country was the Public Works Administration. It built it everywhere in the country. Well, not really in the West Coast. We didn't think of the West Coast as part of the country at that time, but certainly here in the Midwest and the East and the South. And everywhere the Public Works Administration built it, it segregated it. Separate projects for whites and blacks. Frequently, with these projects, segregating communities that hadn't previously been segregated, creating racial segregation patterns for the first time. The first project that the Public Works Administration built was in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia had integrated urban neighborhoods, had segregated water fountains, segregated schools, segregated buses, but integrated neighborhoods, as did many, many urban areas. We'd be stunned if we were transported back to that period of American history to see the extent of urban integration that existed. It existed for a simple reason that I think if you think about it, you'll all realize makes sense. We were a manufacturing economy. None of this internet stuff. It was all making things, and factories had to be located near a deep water port or a railroad terminal to get their parts or ship their final products. So factories were concentrated in a downtown factory district. And if that downtown factory district employed both African American and white workers, they had to live close enough to be able to walk to work frequently. Certainly not drive cars, they didn't have them. Maybe take short streetcar rides. So these were broadly integrated neighborhoods. Atlanta, as I said, had segregated everything else, but integrated neighborhoods. The Public Works Administration went into Atlanta, demolished housing in a neighborhood called the Flats that was about a half white, half black neighborhood, and created a project for whites only, forcing the African Americans who were living in the area that had been cleared to double, triple up with relatives, find other housing, usually much less adequate elsewhere. Here in Ohio, you may know I hope you do, the great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes. He wrote in his autobiography that he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. We don't think of downtown Cleveland as being an integrated place today. But he said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. It's not surprising. That's what you would expect to happen in an integrated neighborhood with an integrated school in it. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood of Ohio, of Cleveland, called the Central Neighborhood, built 2 separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation with those projects and others elsewhere in Cleveland that persists to this day. In my book, The Color of Law, I like where I can to focus on self-satisfied, smug places that think they're better than you are. One of them, maybe some of you have heard of it, was Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white, half black. Public Works Administration demolished integrated housing in that neighborhood to build a separate project for whites, a separate project for African Americans. And with those and other projects elsewhere in the city of Boston, creating segregation that persists to this day. During World War II, the actions of the federal government to segregate this country intensified. Hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production during the war, taking jobs in war plants that hadn't previously existed during the Depression. If the government wanted the tanks and the ships and the aircraft carriers, the jeeps to be produced, it had to somehow find housing for these workers who were migrating from rural areas, black and white, and for whom no housing was available. And so the government everywhere in the country where there's a war plant built war housing, always segregated. Workers in the same plants, same shipyards, same aircraft carriers, aircraft factories, but segregated housing provided by the government, creating patterns of segregation where they hadn't previously existed. The West Coast is a very good example of that because there were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II. The great migration of African Americans to this part of the country took place earlier in the 20th century, but the migration of African Americans to the West Coast didn't really start in big numbers until World War II. So when the government built segregated housing for war workers on the West Coast, it was creating segregation which hadn't previously existed, even in the kind of informal sense that it might have existed in places like this one. In San Francisco, the government built 5 public projects for war workers. 4 were for whites only, 1 was for African Americans, in a neighborhood that then became the African American ghetto of San Francisco. And in Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles, up and down the West Coast, the same thing happened. Segregation was created by government action during the Second World War. After the war, we had an enormous housing crisis still. Not only had very little housing been built during the Depression, except for those public projects I mentioned. During World War II, it was against the law to use construction materials for civilian purposes unless it was for war workers. And then after the war, millions of returning war veterans were coming home needing housing. No housing available, living in open fields and chicken coops and Quonset huts, doubled, tripled up with relatives. A housing crisis that was worse than the one we have today, if you can imagine that. President Truman felt he had to address this housing crisis of returning war veterans primarily, and so he proposed a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program. Now remember, it wasn't for poor people. These were returning war veterans, people who could pay rent. They had jobs in the post-war boom, but no housing was available to them. Conservatives in Congress, led by your senator then, Senator Robert Taft, wanted to defeat Truman's vast expansion of public housing. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons. It was segregated. They didn't mind that. And not because they didn't like poor people. Poor people, as they say, for the most part, weren't permitted in public housing. They wanted to defeat it because Taft and his colleagues said that public housing was socialistic. The government shouldn't be involved in the housing market. The government should leave it alone. The private sector should take care of the needs of returning war veterans. But it wasn't. Then, like now, the private sector was only building housing for the affluent, for the upper middle class and above. And so Truman proposed this program. Conservatives wanted to defeat it, and they came up with a strategy to defeat the expansion of public housing, which at that time was the most desirable housing available. Remember, it was self-supporting for working families with jobs and good employment histories. The conservatives came up with a device to defeat the public housing expansion, which we refer to as a poison pill device. Maybe some of you have heard that term. A poison pill strategy in Congress is one where opponents of a bill propose an amendment to the bill which they think can pass. But then when the full bill comes back up on the floor of the House and Senate as amended, that amendment makes the bill unpalatable to a different majority than the one that supported the amendments, and so the entire bill goes down to defeat. So Taft proposed the following amendment to the 1949 Housing Act. From now on, the amendment said, no more racial discrimination in public housing. It has to be non-discriminatory. We have to end this segregation business in public housing. Of course, it was a cynical proposal. Taft and his fellow conservatives didn't want public housing at all, but they planned to vote for this amendment. They thought they would get northern liberals to vote with them for the amendment. That combination of the conservatives and northern liberals could create a majority so the amendment would pass. And then when the full bill came up on the floor of the House and Senate as a bill requiring no more racial discrimination in public housing, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats who wanted segregated public housing but not non-segregated public housing, so the entire bill would go down to defeat. So liberals in Congress had a very difficult choice to make. It was a devil's bargain. Were they going to support, as many of them wanted to, the non-discrimination amendment, but not address the housing crisis as a result, because no housing would be built if the non-discrimination amendment passed? Or would they oppose the non-discrimination amendment in order to address the affordable housing crisis? It's a difficult decision. I'm not minimizing the difficulty of that decision. But they decided to oppose the non-discrimination amendment. The leading liberal in the Senate at that time was a senator from Illinois, Paul Douglas. Maybe some of you remember that name. You probably certainly remember his closest colleague. He was a senator from Minnesota. He was so committed to civil rights. He was called Mr. Civil Rights, Senator Hubert Humphrey. And they campaigned against the non-discrimination amendment. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Senate and made a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the non-discrimination amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the non-discrimination amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, he persuaded his colleagues. The non-discrimination amendment was defeated. The full 1949 Housing Act was passed as an ongoing segregated program. The federal government used that vote against the non-discrimination amendment as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs for the next 15 years. As I say, it was a difficult choice. I'm not minimizing the difficulty of the choice that the liberals made, but I don't think that we were better off as a result of that choice that they made, because not only did the intensified segregation that resulted from the 1949 Housing Act create and exacerbate the achievement gap that I described before in education, it also predicts health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of heart disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. That's partly attributable to living in less healthy neighborhoods, less access to fresh food, to clean air. It also predicts the mass incarceration crisis that we have today. So many young African American men in particular are being put in jail for low-level crimes. Couldn't happen if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they had less access to jobs and opportunity, and more opportunity to engage in confrontations with police. It also predicts this choice that we made in 1949. I think it predicts a very the very frightening to me, and I think probably to most of you, and dangerous political polarization in this country today, which isn't entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to preserve a democratic society in this country if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to understand each other, to empathize with each other's life experiences? It's hard to imagine how we can preserve this democracy under those circumstances. So those were the consequences of the choice that we made. Under the 1949 Housing Act, we had a vast expansion of public housing. Very soon thereafter, something happened that was quite surprising to policymakers, and that was that all of the white projects, and they were specifically designated as white or black, the projects. Some of you may remember the most famous one probably built under the act was the Pruitt-Igoe homes in St. Louis. Do you remember that, any of you? No? Maybe. Well, called Pruitt-Igoe. It was two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans, Igoe was for whites. Soon the Igoe projects were half empty. The Pruitt projects had long waiting lists, and this was true all over the country. White projects empty, black projects with long waiting lists. Pretty soon even the most bigoted public housing official couldn't justify a situation where some of his projects were half empty and the others had long waiting lists. So all the projects were soon opened up to African Americans, and public housing became a predominantly African American institution. At about the same time, something else happened, and that is that all those factories that I was talking about earlier that had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals no longer had to do so because the highways had been built. So the factories could leave the urban areas where the public housing was located, move out to rural areas and to suburbs. The African Americans who were living in urban areas and public housing and elsewhere had less and less access to good jobs. They became poorer and poorer. Pretty soon, the government had to start subsidizing public housing because the residents, predominantly African American now, could no longer pay the full cost of housing and their rent as they had been doing previously. Once the government began to subsidize it, it stopped investing in it, stopped maintaining it. The projects deteriorated, and we got the kind of concentrated poverty, urban slums that we associate with public housing today. The question is, why did all the white projects develop all those vacancies, and the black projects had long waiting lists? And that was because of another federal program that was equally powerful, probably even more powerful, in segregating this country than the public housing program, and that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration that was explicitly designed to move the entire urban white working class population out of the urban areas into single-family homes in suburbs. And over the course of a decade or so, the Federal Housing Administration suburbanized this country for the first time with single-family home suburbs for whites only, like that one in Louisville that I talked about before, that ringed every metropolitan area in this country. You know these projects. They're here. They're in every metropolitan area in the country. The most famous is probably one east of New York City called Levittown. You've probably heard of that one. 17,000 homes in one place. 17,000 homes. South of San Francisco, there's one in Westlake, 15,000 homes. Los Angeles, Chicago, everywhere here. These projects were built by the Federal Housing Administration for whites only. Levittown, the 17,000 homes, the biggest one, built by William Levitt. Levitt could never have built this project on his own. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to build a development of 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers at a time when nobody thought that suburbanization was going to catch on as a fad. No bank would be crazy enough to do that. The only way that Levitt could build that development, and the only way that every other developer of suburban subdivisions in the mid-20th century was able to build these projects, was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development. The plans had to include, for federal approval, the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets, and an explicit requirement that no home ever be sold to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt and all of these other builders to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And I am quite confident that many of you live in homes with those clauses in their deeds. You know, when we buy a house, we get a stack of papers this thick. Nobody reads them. But if you go and look at your deeds, you'll see that your home is for Caucasians only, many of you. This wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats who imposed this requirement. It was written out in the Federal Policy Manual. The manual, which was distributed to appraisers throughout the country whose job it was to evaluate the applications of developers who wanted to build these projects. The manual said that an appraiser couldn't approve for federal bank guarantees a project that was going to be integrated. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even approve an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would, quote, run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the Federal Policy Manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. It has no basis in historical reality whatsoever. Of course, there was private bigotry. Of course, there was lots of it. But without federal requirement, without federal control, without federal design, the segregation couldn't have happened. William Levitt, for example, was a bigot. If it was left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold a home to an African American in his 17,000 home development, but he wasn't left to his own devices. If, as a condition of his bank guarantee, the Federal Housing Administration said to him, you can get this bank guarantee, but only if you sell homes on a non-discriminatory basis, he would have had no choice but to do so. And if there were some whites, bigoted whites, who didn't want to live in a development with black neighbors, that's okay. There were 10 families wanting to take their place. The housing shortage was so great. So private bigotry cannot explain the segregation that we have. This was a federal program. Now, the white families who bought those homes in these subdivisions in the mid-20th century, as I say, most of them were working class, returning war veterans, had jobs in the post-war economy. The homes were inexpensive. Levittown, when it was built around 1950, the homes were 750 square feet, modest homes. They sold for about $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's a little bit less than $100,000. So these were $100,000 homes. Now, you probably don't know the area very well, so you probably don't know whether you can buy a home in Levittown today for $100,000. Or any of these other subdivisions. Of course, you can't. The homes that white families were subsidized to occupy in the mid-20th century now sell for $500,000, $600,000, and some places where I live, they sell for over $1 million. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth, equity, from the appreciation and the value of their homes. If you buy a home for $100,000 and it's now worth $500,000, you got $400,000 in assets. The white families used those homes to send their children to college. They used it, to take care of emergencies, maybe temporary unemployment. If you have wealth and you lose a job, you can weather that period. If you don't have wealth and lose a job, you get pushed further down the social and economic scale. They used it to finance their retirements. They used it, as I say, to send their children to college, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by federal policy from participating in this wealth-generating exercise. They gained no such wealth. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story behind that. I'm not going to go into it tonight, maybe some other time, but just take it from me, 60% income ratio. You'd think if there was an 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from same incomes. But while African American incomes are 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is only 7% today of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 7% wealth ratio is entirely attributable the unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, that every one of us as American citizens has an obligation to remedy, an obligation we have never taken up. The policies to remedy this are well known to housing experts. There's no mystery about how to fix this. Government did it. Government can undo it. We should, for example, be purchasing homes. The government should be purchasing homes at current market rates in all white suburban communities now and reselling them to qualified African Americans for $100,000 as an affirmative action program in housing. That would be, I know some of you may be lawyers, that's a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. And if a court, unlike John Roberts, understood this history, they would have to accept it as a narrowly targeted remedy to a very specific constitutional violation. We have programs today that reinforce segregation still, federal programs. They no longer are racially explicit. They don't have to be because we've already set up the patterns. So simply reinforcing existing patterns will reinforce segregation. The biggest affordable housing program we have, that's housing for low-income families, is called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's a tax credit that's given to developers to build housing units for low-income families. It reinforces segregation because we make the same choice today that Paul Douglas made in 1949. Do we want to fight segregation, or do we want to build housing? It's easier to build low-income housing in low-income segregated neighborhoods. The Treasury Department even places a premium on using tax credits in low-income neighborhoods rather than elsewhere. It's easier to build them there. There's no community opposition. You don't have to hold 100 meetings, community meetings, explaining why you're bringing black and brown people into someone's neighborhood. The land is cheaper. You can put a sign up in the window and lots of eligible renters will walk by and see it. Why not build there rather than in higher opportunity places that would help to desegregate the country? So there are many, many policies that we could follow to redress segregation. We're not following them, and we won't follow them until there's a new civil rights movement in this country that is as active and engaged and perhaps as militant as the civil rights movement that existed in the 20th century to address other more easily remediated forms of segregation. I'm privileged to be working with a group of national civil rights leaders to try to create a new national committee to redress segregation. It will consist of local committees. We won't be focused on national policy, but on local committees, local civil rights groups that are taking action in their own communities, like this one, to redress segregation. I hope to have an announcement of it sometime within the next 6 months or so. And I was saying to some of you before that if any of you want to receive that announcement, all you have to do is give me your name and email address, and I'll be glad to put you on the list to receive it. But unless we have that civil rights movement, the hole we've dug ourselves is going to be deeper and deeper. The achievement gap, the health disparities, the disparate incarceration, the political polarization, and the wealth gap will continue to exacerbate. And we will perhaps lose the promise of the democratic society that we all hold dear. I am very hopeful that we can redress this. We are now having in this country a more accurate, passionate discussion about the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, about race, than we ever have before in American history. I understand that those discussions are going on here in Upper Arlington, the Equal Upper Arlington program and group. And that's important. But we need to take a step beyond simply discussing and becoming aware and take some action to redress segregation. I'm hopeful that all of you will become committed to that cause. I think it's essential for our own preservation, all of us, and I thank you for your attention.
Wow. As I was sitting in the front row, I could hear the gasps, the shock of surprise for many members of the audience for whom this was new knowledge. And I want to just start off with a couple of comments that reflect my own ignorance. First, I want to say this book is wonderful. It's significant. It's the kind of history that not only needs to be written, it needs to be read, and it also needs to be incorporated in the teaching, for example, of American history in our high schools and in middle schools or whatever. And I can think of one, the school board will hate me for this, but I think perhaps parents might get a little bit more interested in looking at their history books that are being used in terms of what they have to say about American history. But this, the point you're making, really, is that if more of us were aware, there at least would be greater empathy and understanding of the issues that we're dealing with in this country. And then maybe there would be the ability to get to the next step of activism. But let me just tell you about how angry I am about the history that I've been taught. And maybe this is also a problem of my own lack of curiosity, but I read. I have a PhD in political science. That doesn't say a lot, perhaps, but I was telling our speaker that I grew up in New Jersey. I was the recipient of a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship to support my graduate studies. Growing up in New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson was considered to be not just simply a late governor of New Jersey, president of the United States, and a significant international player. And I'm thinking, this is really impressive that a governor of New Jersey has actually moved on up. And then I learned Woodrow Wilson as president was a blatant racist. I learned that many decades later. And I'm wondering, why didn't I know that sooner? Who was providing the materials? Who was covering up in terms of Woodrow Wilson? Well, I do my dissertation, requires me to go to Washington, D.C. I find cheap housing as a graduate student at the residence of the National Women's Party. And some of the original suffragettes, and they were called suffragettes, not suffragists, were still alive. And they were sort of a historical facility, so they couldn't charge rent, but they could accept donations. So for $20 a week in 1969, I spent a couple of months at this facility on Capitol Hill, where I was doing interviewing, right next to one of the Senate office buildings. And I'm thinking, this is wonderful. I get to meet Miss Alice Paul. Those of you who followed the history of the suffragette movement will know that she's one of the 2 or 3 most significant people in that movement. And so I thought this was really wonderful. And I meet her, and I was seeing her just about every day. And one day she says, "Mr. Asher, what do you think of George Wallace?" And I said, well, not very much. The racially segregationist governor of Alabama. And she said to me, well, I really like him a lot. And then she quickly said, because when Wallace could no longer continue serving as governor, he arranged for his wife to succeed him. So I figured, well, maybe that's the perspective that she's looking at him as somebody who advanced women's opportunities. But as I get to know Ms. Paul, she would ask me where I was from and all of that. And one day, and she knew I was from the University of Michigan working on my dissertation. But one day I'm walking through the garden, and she calls me over and says, well, Mr. Asher, where are you from? And I said, New Jersey. And she said, no, where are you from? And I wasn't getting the meaning of her question right away. I said, where are you from? I said, my mother was born in New Jersey, and my father came over at the age of 4, and then I realized that's what she was really. And when I told her that my mother's parents came over from Russia via England, she figured out that we were Jewish and all of that. And she then said, well, we can trace our family back to the mid-1600s in Middlesex County, New Jersey. So we were fellow Jerseyans. I said, oh, that's wonderful. I'm really happy. That's wonderful. The next day, I am walking through the garden, and Miss Paul calls me over to meet one of her lady friends. And she introduces me to her lady friend by saying, this is Mr. Asher. He is working on his PhD at the University of Michigan. And it is so wonderful how far he's come given his background. And I wasn't insulted because I realized at that time I learned something and I would enjoy telling this story for the rest of my life. Well, then I started doing, trying to clear up some of my ignorance. I started learning a little bit more about the suffragettes. And they didn't care about black women. They didn't care about Catholic or Jewish women. They didn't care about, it was a very elitist. Well, that's fine. They made some progress, I guess. But I would love to see now how the history books treat the suffragettes. And this goes to other questions about monuments, buildings, plaques on buildings, who we've honored. I realized, and I kept on going back and forth on, should we take somebody's name off a building or should we not? And I'm thinking, wait a second. Take names off and we'll bury some of the history even further. Let's, in fact, expand the opportunities to learn by changing the plaques, by changing the citations, by letting people read that somebody who may have done some good things also did some, in today's world, very terrible things. And this book was just, eye-opening in terms of how deliberate this was or whatever. So I think it's fantastic. And what we have here, we have a number of questions. And first, people were able to hand in questions in person or do some questions in email. And so I'm going to be asking questions that came from, actually some people who submitted them by email but are in the audience tonight. And let me just begin, because they're making some reference to some of the zoning suggestions that you made in the book. And one question was, have any other countries adopted a single-use type of zoning like the U.S.? What has happened in these other locations and countries?
Well, I apologize, but I'm not really expert in other countries, and so I can't talk about it. But I do think that when I talked about we know what to do about it, that suburban communities with single-family only zoning, frequently on large lot sizes, are one of the biggest obstacles to addressing this program, because those communities, which were initially created as affordable to both blacks and whites, are now no longer affordable to working class families of either race because of single family zoning. And abolishing that kind of zoning, permitting townhouses, garden apartments, even low-level apartment buildings, is an essential step that we need to take if we take seriously our obligation to redress segregation.
We have a number of questions referring to restrictive covenants. And one question simply asked, if the deed to my home has a restrictive covenant prohibiting non-Caucasians from living there, even though it's unenforceable, can I remove it?
No, you can't change your deed any more than you can decide you're going to change the description of the property line. The deed is the deed. What you can do, and in the back of my book I make this recommendation, is you can append something to it repudiating it. And in various states, I don't know about Ohio, but in some states there are provisions for appending a repudiation. It's analogous to what you were saying about the renaming of buildings. Instead of renaming it, contextualize it. And in some states, you can repudiate it. And maybe that's a campaign that Equal Upper Arlington should undertake.
Maybe a recommendation to our local area state legislators to in fact say that many citizens find these covenants offensive, but we need a change in the law to do something about that. And that'll certainly bring attention to the issue. Another question makes reference here, and it really goes back to what you said to the audience earlier. What other actions can residents take to start to undo some of that legacy, to make our communities, to make Upper Arlington more just? Do you see communities in the United States that are really have made a lot of progress along the lines that you're talking about?
Well, I don't know of any communities that made a lot of progress, but many communities are making some progress. Perhaps you know that the cities of Minneapolis and Portland recently abolished single-family zoning. It's only a first step, because you can abolish single-family zoning and still not racially desegregate the community. You can simply create condominiums and townhouses for professionals who are being priced out of markets today. But it's a first step. There are communities that have policies that we call inclusionary zoning, which is an ordinance that requires any development to include both mixed income, that is moderate income and low income, as well as affluent units within it. And there are communities that have done something like that. So that, yes, there are communities that are making progress. If I can come back to something you said earlier just for a second, I don't know, I should have looked before we started, but I don't know if the copies of the book that they're selling is the most recent printing. But in the last year or so, a group of teachers have developed an alternative curriculum that can be used in high schools to teach this particular history that I've been talking about. And the website for it is in the back of the most recent printing of the book. Did you get yours here or a long time ago?
No, this one is here tonight.
Can I take a look at it for a second?
Oops, sorry.
Yes, right after page 342, if you got your book either here or recently from most recent printing, there's a page called Additional Resources for Middle and High School Teachers. And it includes not only a curriculum unit, but also a 17-minute animated video, which is an excellent summary that can be used in high school classes. One thing that a local community can do is not just make this something voluntary that well-informed high school teachers or middle school teachers do, but you can demand that your school district reform its curriculum so that teaching this history accurate is required, not only by teachers who voluntarily decide to do it, but as part of the curriculum as so many other things are required.
We had another question that actually was referring to other kinds of resources, and we're really asking about museums, libraries, places of interest that people might go in order to become more informed if they want to go in depth on some of the research themselves.
Well, there's a lot of it today. As I said before, we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow than we ever have before in American history. The African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. is a phenomenal place. If you ever have an opportunity to go to Washington, I think you should visit it. There's a museum in Montgomery, Alabama that's been created by Brian Stevenson, that is also a phenomenal place to visit. So yes, there's a lot of this going on, and we're self-educating ourselves for the first time. And I think we always have to keep in mind is how do we move beyond self-education into action.
Are there any other cases going through the court system that might eventually reach the Supreme Court and try once again to help the court understand the difference between de jure and de facto?
I don't think so. The Supreme Court is a political institution. It follows not public opinion, but it follows dominant opinion in the country. Many of you may know this history. In the 1930s, the 14th Amendment I mentioned before, the Civil Rights Amendment passed after the Civil War, was adopted for the purpose of giving African Americans former slave citizenship and full citizenship rights. The Supreme Court in the early 20th century interpreted the 14th Amendment as being solely for the purpose of protecting property rights. And so it struck down minimum wage laws and child labor laws and health and safety laws on the grounds that children should have an unabridged constitutional right to negotiate freely with their employers. And you shouldn't have child labor laws as a result. That's what the Supreme Court ruled. And then Franklin Roosevelt won re-election by an overwhelming margin in 1936. He threatened the Supreme Court, and all of a sudden it changed its mind and said, well, maybe these laws are okay. And it's going to take the same kind of change in public opinion. I don't mean necessarily a majority, but an effective public opinion that only a civil rights movement can create to get the court to take a different view. Simply pursuing cases now, I think, is not terribly productive.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot since we're just in the context
Please do.
In the context of a presidential campaign and a few weeks away from the Ohio primary. But you did such a wonderful job of linking the segregation in housing to so many other, I'll call them pathologies, but so many other phenomenon that we're worried about. Do you see organizations, individuals, groups or whatever out there that are talking about these in this comprehensive, holistic way that you have?
Well, no, but I wouldn't expect them to, because active citizens can't deal with every problem at once. There are groups dealing with criminal justice reform, Black Lives Matter, for example. There are groups dealing with voter suppression. There are groups dealing with other civil rights matters. There are groups dealing with affordable housing. A lot of affordable housing groups out there. Affordable housing is important, but it's not the same as non-segregated housing, as I indicated earlier. We can take the Douglas approach and build our affordable housing in ways that reinforces segregation. So what we need is a group that's focused specifically, our groups that are focused specifically, I think, on residential segregation. Not to the exclusion of any other things, but I don't think any single group can address every problem at once.
The last question that I have here, and it's sort of a takeoff on the affordable housing. Columbus is spending a lot of time now talking about affordable housing. You've helped me better understand that talking about affordable housing is not the same thing as addressing the more fundamental problems, but are there ways of building into whether city ordinances or, the requirements for getting tax breaks, abatements, or whatever, provisions that might, under the rubric of affordable housing, at least begin to address?
Sure. I'll talk about your favorite state, which is not Ohio, as you all know. New Jersey has a program called a Fair Share Program, which was required now by law, in which every community in New Jersey has to create housing opportunities for its fair share of its metropolitan area's low-income population. Now, it's not racially explicit. That's not permitted under today's Supreme Court rulings, but given the demographics of New Jersey, when communities do provide housing for their fair share of the metropolitan area's low-income population, they affect desegregation as well.
I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of all of us. One way to tell how engaged an audience is by the absence of fidgeting, coughs, sneezing, whatever. This was one of the most, and I'm sitting in the front row, one of the most silent, engaged. You could feel the intensity. So thank you very much.